Nobody in Bramble County, Kentucky thought much of it at first. Two 9-year-old girls chasing lightning bugs across their family's back pasture every evening that June. Twins did that kind of thing. But by the middle of July, Nora and Junie Sadler weren't chasing anything anymore. They were standing still in the tall grass after dark, notebooks in hand, counting, watching, writing down numbers in the fading light of a single dim flashlight covered with a red cloth, night after night, for reasons neither of them explained to a single adult. Their older cousins thought it was babyish. Their mother assumed it was a phase, the kind of thing children do for 3 weeks and then forget entirely. Their father, Curtis Sadler, was too preoccupied that summer with a decision bearing down on the family to pay the girls' evening ritual much mind at all. By August, a land trust attorney and a university entomologist would be standing in that same pasture with a formal offer on the table worth $2 million. And it would all trace back to 2 girls with flashlights and a shared notebook nobody had thought to ask about. If stories about quiet curiosity, family, and the surprising value hiding in ordinary places matter to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story means something to you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like the Sadler girls. Now let's find out what Nora and Junie were really counting, and why it mattered more than anyone in Bramble County could have guessed. Bramble County sits in the low hill country of western Kentucky, cut through with hardwood bottomland and unglaciated pasture that had stayed largely undeveloped for generations, more by economic accident than intention. The Sadler family had farmed 110 acres there since the 1950s, raising a modest herd of beef cattle and hay on ground that had never made anyone rich, but had kept 3 generations fed and mostly out of debt. Curtis Sadler had inherited the farm from his own father 8 years earlier, and had spent most of that time working harder for smaller margins than his father ever had. As cattle prices wobbled and hay costs climbed, that spring, a regional development firm had approached him with an offer to buy the back 40 acres, the lowest, wettest stretch of pasture along the county's undeveloped Tully Creek, for a proposed subdivision. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more cash than the farm had seen in a single transaction in Curtis's lifetime, and he was seriously considering it, quietly, without saying much to his wife Denise or his daughters about how close he'd come to signing. Nora and Junie were identical twins, though anyone who knew them well could tell them apart in an instant. Nora was the quieter one, methodical, the kind of child who lined her crayons up by color before she'd use them. Junie talked more, moved faster, and had exactly the kind of restless curiosity that got her sent to sit on the porch steps more than once that spring for chasing barn cats through the garden. What they shared, completely and without any real explanation, was an obsession that started in early June with something almost embarrassingly simple: catching fireflies in mason jars the way children in Bramble County had done for generations. It might have stayed that simple if their grandfather, Emmett Sadler, hadn't still been alive and living in the small house down the lane. Emmett was 79, a retired high school science teacher who'd spent 34 years teaching biology to Bramble County teenagers before retiring to raise bees and read entomology journals nobody else in the family had much interest in. When his granddaughters showed up at his porch one June evening proudly displaying a jar of captured fireflies, he didn't just admire them the way most grandfathers would. He asked them a question that changed the whole summer. "Did you notice they don't all blink the same?" The girls hadn't. Emmett brought out an old field guide, its spine cracked from decades of use, and showed them something most people never think to look for. Different firefly species have different flash patterns, distinct in timing, color, and rhythm, almost like a signature. Some flash in short, quick pulses. Some glow in a slow, drawn-out arc. Males and females of the same species often signal to each other in a kind of coded conversation, invisible to anyone who isn't paying close attention. Nora, methodical as ever, wanted to know if you could tell the species apart just by watching. Emmett admitted he wasn't entirely sure, not with certainty, not for every species in the guide, but he told them that real naturalists documented exactly that kind of thing, patiently over whole seasons, and that nobody, as far as he knew, had ever done it seriously on the Sadler property. That was all it took. The girls started that same week, and what began as an evening game turned, by early July, into something considerably more disciplined than either of their parents realized. They divided the back pasture into rough sections using landmarks they already knew: the fence corner, the fallen sycamore, the edge of the wet ground near Tully Creek. Each night after dinner, they walked the sections with Emmett's old field guide, a shared composition notebook, and a flashlight wrapped in red cloth, because Emmett had explained that white light disturbs the insect's natural signaling and red light doesn't. They recorded flash color, pattern, timing, and, as best two 9-year-olds could manage, rough counts of how many fireflies appeared in each section on a given night. Most evenings looked ordinary enough on paper, familiar species Emmett could identify easily from their descriptions. But the wet, undeveloped ground closest to Tully Creek, the exact stretch of pasture Curtis was quietly considering selling to the development firm, kept producing something different. A slow, distinct double-pulse flash, blue-green rather than the common yellow, appearing only in a narrow window just after full dark, and only in that one section of the property. Their cousin Beau, 16 and visiting for a week in July, watched the twins head out one evening with their notebook and flashlight and laughed outright. "Y'all are being paid to count bugs now?" he asked. "That's the saddest job I ever heard of." Nora ignored him. Junie told him, with the particular certainty of a 9-year-old who has decided something is important, that he simply didn't understand what they were doing. Beau didn't argue further, mostly because he genuinely didn't care enough to. Denise Sadler found the whole thing charming for the first few weeks and increasingly puzzling as it continued into July, with no sign of the girls losing interest. "You know this can't go on all summer," she told them once, not unkindly, more out of a mother's habit of expecting childhood enthusiasms to burn out on schedule. The girls kept going anyway. Curtis noticed them coming in later than usual most evenings, dew-damp and quiet with concentration, and assumed, when he thought about it at all, that it was simply what children did in a summer without much else to occupy them. By the last week of July, Emmett had grown genuinely curious himself. The double-pulse blue-green pattern the girls kept describing didn't match anything clearly in his old field guide, and when he mentioned it, almost as an aside, to a former colleague who now taught at a university 2 hours away, the response came back faster and more serious than he expected. Dr. Alice Renner, an entomologist who specialized in firefly taxonomy and had spent much of her career documenting the decline of several rare species across the eastern United States, asked if she could come see the property directly, and if the girls would be willing to show her exactly where and when they'd been observing the pattern. She arrived on a Thursday evening in early August, and spent nearly 3 hours in the back pasture with Nora and Junie as guides, the two of them walking her through their sections with a confidence that clearly surprised her. When the distinct blue-green double-pulse finally appeared, low over the wet ground near the creek, Dr. Renner went still in a way the girls would later describe to their grandfather as like she forgot to breathe. What the twins had documented, patiently and without any idea of its significance, was an active population of a firefly species considered functionally extirpated from most of its historic range in the region, a species that depended on exactly the kind of undisturbed, seasonally wet bottomland the Sadler family's back pasture still preserved, ground that had escaped drainage, tilling, and development for reasons that had never been more than lucky accident. Dr. Renner explained carefully that confirmed populations of this species had not been documented anywhere in 3 surrounding counties in over a decade, and that habitat loss, largely from wetland drainage and residential development, was believed to be the primary reason. Curtis Sadler learned, in the space of one uncomfortable evening conversation with his own daughters and a university researcher standing in his kitchen, exactly how close he'd come to selling the one piece of ground that made his farm scientifically significant to anyone outside Bramble County. Word moved quickly after that, the way it does when a university researcher starts making phone calls. Dr. Renner connected the family with a regional land trust that had, for several years, been quietly identifying and protecting exactly the kind of remnant habitat the Sadler Creek bottom represented. Within 3 weeks, the trust's attorney and a habitat conservation specialist were sitting at the Sadler's kitchen table with a formal proposal: a conservation easement on the back 40 acres, permanently protecting it from development while allowing continued cattle grazing under carefully managed conditions, paired with a direct land value payment reflecting both the ecological significance of the site and the fact that it would no longer carry development potential. The number on the table, once every detail had been assessed and negotiated, came to just over $2 million. Curtis didn't sign anything that first week. He walked the pasture alone several evenings after that meeting, the way his daughters had taught him to, watching for the blue-green pulse near the creek without fully admitting to himself what he was looking for. Denise found him out there one night in late August, notebookless, simply watching. "I almost sold the one thing on this whole farm nobody could ever replace," he told her. She didn't say anything back. She didn't need to. The Sadlers signed the conservation agreement that October. Curtis used part of the payment to modernize the working side of the farm, new fencing, updated equipment, a long overdue barn repair, while the protected wetland pasture stayed exactly as it had always been, undisturbed, undrained, and now permanently safe from the subdivision that had nearly claimed it. Bo, who'd mocked the whole project in July, came back that Thanksgiving and asked, with noticeably less swagger, if the twins would walk him out to see the fireflies' habitat, even though it was far too cold in November for anything to be flashing. Emmett Sadler kept a framed copy of Dr. Renner's published field survey on his living room wall, twin 9-year-old field assistants credited by name in the acknowledgments. When people in Bramble County asked Nora and Junie how they'd known something was out there worth protecting, they usually gave some version of the same answer. They hadn't known. They just wanted to see if the bugs were really all the same, and it turned out they weren't, and that was worth writing down. There's a particular kind of value that never announces itself loudly. It sits in wet, overlooked ground that nobody thought to drain only because nobody got around to it, in a species that survives quietly for decades in the one corner of a county still left alone. Nora and Junie Sadler didn't set out to save $2 million worth of family land or protect a species most of their neighbors had never heard of. They set out on an ordinary June evening to count something nobody else had bothered counting, and in doing exactly that, patiently, night after night, with nothing more than a notebook and a flashlight wrapped in red cloth, they showed an entire county that the things worth the most are sometimes the ones easiest to overlook.